Awesome. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Footman. I am the inaugural executive director of In Community Violence Now, which is a public private partnership that was established formally in January 2024, so a little over a year ago, and really with the goal of providing support to our community violence ecosystem, and stemmed from the 2014 Newsweek article that identified Wilmington at the time as Murder Town. And so at the time, philanthropy, inclusive of Longwood Foundation, Welfare Foundation, and Jesse Ball DuPont, with then Governor Carney and Christiana CARE came together with community groups to figure out what are some of the long-term solutions to uh, uh, facilitate and address gun violence in a thoughtful way. And so my background, which brings me to this work, is I've worked in government, I've also worked in nonprofit, and also have worked in corporate. I'm looking, really working at the intersections of community and policy, and have worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion roles. Also have worked in some policy advocacy and community engagement roles. Some of the work that I've done primarily in the gun violence prevention space has been with the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence, working on their community engagement, outreach and programming, and also thinking about equitable policy development. And so I am someone who is very connected to this cause and was really excited about the opportunity to not only meet with you, but even just to embark on this journey within Community Violence Now, or ECVN, as we call it for short, just to build upon a lot of the great work that has been happening in Delaware. I believe you all have worked with my colleague, Tracy Murphy, who's also a board member who leads the Coalition for Safer Delaware and Delaware Against Gun Violence, thinking about how do we build on the momentum of the policy wins that Delaware has had to ensure that community violence is directly a part of that conversation, which we may hear a lot about on the news. And so I'm happy to share time with you this evening to share more about ECVN and also about what community violence has look like historically in the state of Delaware and how it continues to kind of evolve as time goes on. Because we know primarily a lot of the conversations have been around Wilmington and Newcastle, but in recent years between Kent with Dover and in Sussex County with Milford and Laurel and Seaford, they've seen upticks in violence. And so making sure that there is a whole statewide approach, which we hope to be part of, and I can share some of the work that we plan or currently have been doing with the newly established Office of Gun Violence Prevention that was established just a couple weeks ago by Governor Meyer. But before we jump in, are there any questions? Okay. So ECVN is a public-private partnership to address community violence. And we will follow this agenda, but of course, I hope this will be a conversation, particularly because we are an intimate group. So definitely feel free to jump in. I won't be able to see the chat or if you raise your hand. So feel free just to come off mute and ask any questions or share any feedback or thoughts. So we'll just go over the problem, the solution, some of the historical context that has really got us to this point, overview of ECV and the opportunity, and then of course a formal opportunity for question and answers. And so when we think about what is the problem as it relates to community gun violence, and I think it's really important for us to drill down on community violence because, again, there is a lot of types of violence, such as school shootings or also suicide by firearm. And so what we're talking about is looking at community violence, which is in community. And so when we think about firearm violence, it being the leading cause of death for American children and teens, and 81% of all homicides in Delaware definitely involve a firearm. And so when we think about um, Delaware's rate of gun violence, I think sometimes we're like, oh, it's not a lot in comparison to a another state or another city. However, because the size of Delaware, when you look at the per capita data, it is a bit disproportionate and which is causes alarm. And so I know Sue talked about some of the work that you all have done around racial justice and equity. One of the things that is evident through this work is that in Delaware, Black people are 14 times more likely to die than their white counterparts by gun violence. So there is definitely an element of equity and racial equity work when doing this work thoughtfully. And then where we kind of come in to frame the conversation is gun violence is not only a human relational issue of the loss of life, but there is a financial impact to taxpayers within the state of Delaware, and it's roughly about $1.4 billion each year, 44.4 million, which is paid by taxpayers. With the current state of gun violence. And so, as we see the increases in Kent and Sussex, these are numbers that potentially could grow, but maybe balance out. We'll see, because there have been some substantial declines to pre-pandemic levels in Newcastle County because of the declines in Wilmington. But this is kind of how we're framing the conversation and recognizing not only is it a leading cause, not only is it a economic impact, it is a public health issue that we need to think about thoughtfully. And so when we think about what are some of the reasons for this problem is it's the unstable, insufficient funding to some of the evidence-based programming that is happening. And one of the things to note is in this most recent administration, there has been some substantial cuts to gun violence prevention programming that a lot of our community-based organizations can apply to. And so some states and some programs had staff have to be immediately laid off after some of the most recent cuts. And there's recently been a class action suit filed by some national partners to address this. But again, we know that insufficient funding and historic disinvestment in the communities we're trying to help are some of the drivers of gun violence. And so we kind of are, both of these things are happening at the same time. And so not only is it insufficient funding, there is no capacity building for the nonprofits that are doing this work, particularly understanding they're coming from historically disinvested communities, which comes with its own set of challenges for the individuals in communities leading this work. Lack of evaluation and research, so helping people understand what are the opportunities to be impactful and make essentially augmentations, and really understanding how they can leverage data to improve outcomes. And then inability to access data to make data informed decisions, and then siloed, uncoordinated efforts. One of the things that I'll point out about data is that a lot of times I think people in Delaware have used the Delaware News Journal, but through the mechanism of how they have to access that data and the fact that it is a third party um, data source, people often can say like, oh, how do we know the data is accurate? What about the changes that may come after further reporting? How does that then get translated to a third party? And so that's been something we've been spending a lot of time with, trying to work with state partners really to understand how do we get access to credible data so we can be monitoring this important problem, which is critical if we're applying a public health approach. So we've talked about what some of the problems are and what some of the numbers are, but then we think about what are the solutions, and it takes the comprehensive approach that is public and private. And so we recognize it's intervention, targeted enforcement, prevention, healing, and macro level change. And so that all would lead to the reduction in gun violence if applied thoughtfully and consistently. And so we recognize we can say like we want all these things, but how do you make sure this is happening? And this is really what ECVN was created to do. We strategize, coordinate, fundraise, grant, make, advocate, and educate. And so a lot of what we do is working with our existing communities, intervention organizations, and also our hospital-based interventions like the Evolve program at Christiana Care, gun violence intervention, which is housed at the state through the Department of DHS. And how do we work with them in the community-based organizations to really align the ecosystem around evidence-based interventions, ensure that they have the resources from a technical perspective and a fundraising perspective to scale and really meet the increasing and evolving needs of their community as it relates to gun violence. And so we fundraise and grant make. We'll be actually running a grant making pilot program this summer, facilitated by an investment of the Longwood Foundation. And then we do advocating, really doing a lot of conversations with partners, those who are directly impacted, and also lawmakers, to really think about what are some of the policy interventions, funding interventions, programmatic interventions that we need to sustain this work. And that ties very well into educating what is the public health approach to violence prevention, and also educating on what are some best practices from other ecosystems, whether they're state-based or community or municipal based. Before I move on, are there any questions?
I have a comment,
Yeah.
Lauren. A phrase that you used
Yeah.
really struck me. You talked about historically disinvested communities. And in my experience, in recent times, the shift had occurred from underprivileged communities to underserved communities. And that implies something about the relationship between services and people. But historically disinvested means the money's there, it's just not being put into use to, I think, fundamentally solve the problems as opposed to deal with the symptoms. I was just really struck by that phrase. I think it's very significant.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that is one of the things that we see of recognizing. And so there's the organization, of course, in Wilmington Center for Structural Equity. And one of the things that I really applaud them for is really talking about, we talk about, the physical violence, but the structural violence that exist, and the ways that the systems by their design a lot of times facilitate the environment for violence. And so I think that it is important to name, particularly in this time period, that a lot of what we are experiencing in communities could um not be this way, and or could be being directly addressed in a way to address the core root. Because I think you go, um when you say addressing the symptoms, but yes, how are we addressing some of the social determinants or the vital conditions that create these outcomes of gun violence, recognizing that gun violence is a symptom of all of these inequities. And it's one of the things that I know that I'm bracing for this summer, as we think about, yes, the disinvestment in the programs that specifically do intervention and prevention work, but also the disinvestment in the social services, the social safety nets that can change health outcomes for communities, and impact economic opportunity, mobility, etc. And so again, what we're seeing is that we know that more resources were needed to address the historic disinvestment, but instead of going in the opposite direction to maybe try to level set and address some of these historic and contemporary realities, we're further disinvesting from communities that need it most. And so I think what we're seeing is just maybe more a blatant act to do that, but recognizing they're taking away from communities that were already struggling to begin with, that we could trace back to um, redlining, slavery, etc. And so I think that it'll just be very interesting to see how the violence prevention space and response to this current moment, but also the unfortunate piece of how communities may deal with the brunt of some of these decisions that will exacerbate some of these historic disinvestments that I think some of us have gotten very clear on being able to acknowledge, but I think none of us expected that we'd be living through a cycle of where that may be perpetuated moving forward. And so this kind of goes to kind of the historical context of ECVN and really the gun violence prevention ecosystem that just may be helpful. There was a 2018 funded analysis from philanthropy, And then there was a GVI Delaware launch, which I mentioned, 2019. Christiana Care was able to restart their program. And then the investors were convened by the governor to coordinate efforts. And then there's been this philanthropic investment and community-based programming. There's been intervention of practice, which we now lead to really talk about how do we support and provide organizations not only understanding where they need funding, but where do they need training, where do they need other capacity building, whether it's compliance, whether it's research and evaluation, and then really thinking about this sustainable governance model. And then 2022 stakeholders aligned on a community-based OVP, that's ECVN. And then there was the work design, board of directors designed an ECVN launch. It's important to note, I mentioned that Tracy is a board member, but we do have representation from our philanthropic community, those individuals with lived experience from across the state. So there's representation from all three counties, but also from the current governor's administration, law enforcement, and also there's representation for individuals that work in the business community to make sure that our leadership is very reflective of this public-private partnership and that is a through line. So we have people looking at it from all those different vantages in our decision making.
Just as a comment, we got involved with this topic in the 2019-2020 time period when we had speakers um, talking with us about the gun violence intervention, GVI, and also with the Christiana program. I forget the name of the physician.
Evolve.
Thank you. Yes, and the physician spoke to us about that program. So we've seen some of the early stages and the hard work that's been going on, but it sounds like that this next step with ECVN is to try to pull all of that together in a way that hopefully serves as some sort of a coordinator or multiplier as opposed to sort of each doing their own thing.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And so, yes, we speak often with our colleagues that are doing this work, whether GVI and with the new Office of gun violence prevention and community safety, how they now will support GVI and really the ecosystem as a whole. And that is really our goal to think about how we can understand what are the gaps, where do we need more programming, where do we need to fundraise to bring public-private dollars to the forefront. And so really what we do is to do a lot of surveying engagement. What do you need? What do you need? What are some of the training needs that you have? What are, of course, some of the financial needs or constraints that you have, particularly in this funding environment where we recognize that federal funding may become more difficult to access for various reasons. And then philanthropy is going to be pulled in different spaces just to try to meet that need. Like, how do we strategically leverage our resources and do it thoughtfully? And in this environment where things may become more competitive from a fundraising perspective, be able to thoughtfully manage. Be able to thoughtfully share the research and evaluation to talk about the impact and different refinements that are being made. And so our goal definitely here is to grow a unified, because there is a ecosystem that exists, but our zeroing in on the unified piece and thinking of our vision is really to have where every person in Delaware is safe from community violence. And so these are our values. One of our values that we've added since my coming on board is equity and really making sure that we're equitable and how we're engaging with community members, with the community violence intervention organizations. But a big part of that also is making sure that we are paying attention to below the canal, and making sure that communities that maybe have had historic disinvestment on this particular topic or maybe other topics that may be driving where the root causes may be driving gun violence, but just really making sure that we have a physical presence as much as a virtual presence with our communities. And so that's something that we're definitely um, conscious of, and really working to model these values as much as encourage these values with our ecosystem partners. And so the opportunity that really exists for us is ensuring the ecosystem is aligned, working towards a common agenda, and implementing evidence-based programs with fidelity and thinking thoughtfully. Again, what are the supports that people need to do that? Because like this is the goal, but how do we take a step back and say, based on where people are, how what type of support do we need to help get them there? And so some of the things we're currently doing now is developing a landscape analysis to understand where are their organizations, where are their what are their strengths, what are their opportunities, how can we fill in the gaps. And this is the first time that there's been this community-based office of violence prevention. And so one of the opportunities we also have now with a statewide office of violence prevention is really to serve as a partner, connector, convener to community, but then also some of those national technical assistance providers, advocates, who can really provide access and information to that office, but then also make sure that those national partners and thought leaders and people who have done this, we can connect our community intervention organizations and partners to them so they can learn firsthand on some of the lessons learned and also doing some of the things that have proven effective in other places. And so that
Office, that Office of Violence Prevention, is that the organization recently announced by Governor Meyer? Is that the,
Yes,
okay.
yes, that is that office. And so it is in the Department of Homeland Security, being led by Deputy Secretary Vaughn Bond and being supported by the Office of the Governor with Romaine Alexander, Jasmine Minhas, and Policy Director Kane. And so that is one of our newest partners in the space. And so we've been very excited to be able to partner with them, and not only celebrate the milestone of creating the office, but help to hopefully be a good thought partner in how to think about implementing a public health approach to that office. And so I can stop sharing my screen and happy to answer any questions that may come up.
Do you engage at all with organizations like Moms Demand Action?
Yep, we do. So we just partnered on Advocacy Day with Moms Demand, Every Town, Students Demand, and the Coalition for a Safer Delaware, a couple weeks ago. And so we do, this was my first Advocacy Day since I started to roll in September, but we've had different events where we've brought national partners to Delaware specifically to learn about the Wilmington intervention community, and so Moms Demand in Every Town were both a part of that. And so yes, we do have a open line of communication and have also partnered and engaged with them on certain events. Roger.
Um, I'm dismayed about what's going on in Dover lately. It seems like Dover's going down a path that maybe Wilmington went down a couple decades ago. Are
Mm-hmm.
the problems in Dover the same that we see in Wilmington with gun violence, or is it different based? Are there different problems in Dover than Wilmington? Because gee, we should have learned something in Wilmington, and now we see that Dover is declining. What can we apply that we've learned in Wilmington to prevent this slide of Dover? I've heard people leaving Dover because they say, well, the mall's going away, and we're just getting out. It's very discouraging. That's our capital, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, I think that there's a couple different things going on. And so, yes, one of the things, GVI was, of course, in Wilmington, Newcastle, and then they expanded to Dover, in Kent, and then now they're expanding to Sussex. And so I think there's definitely been this conversation of what can we learn from Newcastle, And I think that that's where ECVN can come in to really help for the capacity standpoint. So GBI is now present in Dover. And one of the things I can say is the fact that GBI is present means that through their process with a problem analysis, that means that they had identified gang um, related activity.
Mhm.
And they've identified individuals that they can do intervention with. So it means that they met their criteria. And so I definitely think that there was this idea for a long time that it was just like maybe a Newcastle issue. And I think recent years have shown us that it's becoming more of where the News Journal did an article earlier this year where they said that, again, Newcastle was down to pre-pandemic levels, but with Kent and Sussex, it was going the other way and there was an increase. And so I think that this state government, building upon what Governor Carney did, they saw the trends. And so when community members reached out and raised the red flag in Sussex, they responded and laid the groundwork for a GVI expansion. So I think that people know that we need to, and that's been part of our messaging from the beginning, is that we see when there's coordination around strategy and investment. And when partners are talking to each other, there is a decline, which we see in Newcastle, but we do need to replicate that. So GVI is one of the interventions, but how then do we scale the other interventions and how our partners, whether that's public and private, thinking about gun violence in those spaces? Because I think where the state may have been paying attention to some of the trends because of GVI, are we expanding the community intervention capacities that go along with GVI and the hospital-based intervention? How are we expanding those things? And also, are they on the same level and radar? Because I think people kind of have like branded Wilmington, like we kind of know this is an issue, but did people kind of say like, oh, that will never happen here? And now it is
Mhm.
happening here. And so I think that people's eyes are open. People in this administration are paying attention. I know that Governor Meyer and his administration and him himself are making themselves available. I will say that we were just with Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester in April in Laurel directly. So like they're understanding like we can no longer, they know that this is not just a Newcastle issue. And so I think that that is a positive sign, to say the least.
Yeah, you have to
Lauren,
recognize the problem first before you can apply it.
Yes, and so I think that they know that 100%. And when you mentioned about the economic, that's a huge piece, right? Economic development, economic
Yes.
opportunity, access to social services, whether it's mental health, access to quality education, things that I know that are a priority of all of the people we just talked about. All of those things go together. And so when we take a step back and we look at lack of economic opportunity or the leaving of economic opportunity in business, that can be an indicator that it paints the picture. And so we've seen it before. And so I think that those things are definitely not mutually exclusive, that they're happening at the same time. And
Yeah.
why we want when we think about the public private partnership, we want the business community to be at the table because again, violence can impact businesses wanting to stay.
Yeah, that's right. And
Lauren, we've had I mentioned we had a program on GVI, but I'm not sure that everybody who's going to end up watching the video, or perhaps even all of us who are here tonight, understand what GVI is. Could you just give us the the topic sentences or the basic premises of GVI and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the GVI model is one of the evidence-based intervention models that exists to address community violence. And so it works with the top 1% of the 1% of those that are identified to either be victims or perpetrators of gun violence and provides them they call it the carrot stick, but social services or intervention by law enforcement, which I will say is a little different in Delaware, is that I've seen it be the social service piece really be built out. And so that's actually housed within the Department uh, of Health and Social Services, which is great. And so that's led by John Cook and his team. And so that's GVI, support and outreach. So they do the case management and do like the clinical intervention. And so that model was one of the models that kind of came and was brought to Delaware after a lot of the ideation. And so they currently operate at capacity in Newcastle County, in Dover, well, in I should say Kent County, and then there has been conversations about expansion to Sussex. They've been doing, I guess, what you would call like a stretch or a pilot in Laurel after some of the most recent upticks in violence after the outreach to Governor Carney, and which has also continued. And there's conversations of expansion under the Meyer administration. But one thing to note is that that is actually administered through the state. So it is the intervention, but it is administered through a state agency. And some of the other organizations we've talked about, like the Christiana Care, like that's through the hospital, and then the other programs are community-based 501(c)(3)s. And so people call it the carrot and stick model because it's social services and a there's an opportunity for law enforcement to also interact with the individuals that are identified because they've been identified as someone who is at high risk, again, to be a victim or perpetrator, and they kind of identify them and proactively go to them to have that conversation.
Thank you. Sandy?
That leads a little bit into my question, which is how closely do you communicate and collaborate with various police departments?
So I personally do not like in terms of intelligence communicate with police, but in terms of understanding just what are some of the trends that they're seeing in their respective communities. I've primarily engaged with the Laurel Police Department because that was one of the places we were seeing upticks. And so just to understand even from a fundraising perspective and what are some of their um things that they want to do, like for example in Sussex and Laurel in particular, they want to have a police athletic league. And so like what are some of the resources that they need to do that, and making connections with whether it's state grants, federal grants, or even the philanthropic grants where we can work with grassroots partners. So I have engaged with law enforcement. I guess you would consider Homeland Security law enforcement as well, too, to some degree. Former Secretary Nate McQueen is actually one of our board members. And we also engaged with this current Office of Violence Prevention, which is in um, Homeland Security as well. So we do have open lines of communication, but in terms of actual engaging around intelligence, that's not something that we currently do.
Thank you.
Awesome. Roger?
Yes. What's your role in looking at legislation? And I'll just give an example. There's legislation in Dover this year about utility bills and trying to say that we need to offer more assistance to low-income families on utility bills to relieve the stress of, not being able to have electricity, gas, and water. There's also a lot of initiative that we've had on in this space about homelessness, and 1% of the Delaware budget should be, appropriated for increasing of housing. What is your organization's interface with any legislative opportunities or our legislators themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't per se advocate for a particular bill because of our 501(c)(3) status. However, we do stay very much abreast of the legislative landscape and do a lot of information sharing holistically on the public health approach. And I frame it from the public health approach because the public health approach brings up exactly the things you're talking about. Because we don't just talk about the legislation that's just on the firearm, so to speak, which some people say like gun control legislation. We're looking at holistically, like, yes, you do need to have common sense gun safety laws on the books, but then you also need to look at homelessness. You also need to look at what you're talking about as it relates to people's bills and having assistance there. Sometimes I will end up talking about homelessness more than actually talking about firearms in my role, because I recognize that that is affordable housing is an issue in Delaware, like it is in many states and many communities, and is one of the drivers of one of the root causes of gun violence. So it's definitely something that we work with our partners who do a lot of political advocacy around helping them not only think about the unintended consequences of firearm legislation and making sure they're doing a RE equity analysis on bills and making sure that community voice is informing their advocacy on bills, but then also helping partners think about what are some of those other bills that actually can impact communities that can be drivers of violence, and thinking about how do you build a more robust policy agenda. I just had a conversation with Tracy and some others around moving how how do we consider those policies that don't say firearm as a part of the actual policy agenda for the gun violence prevention movement. And so I know it's something that is an ongoing conversation. An example of that was there was a community health worker bill to assess the feasibility of streamlining that process and coming up with a recommendation for community health workers and making that more of a streamlined process at the state. And so you're like, well, what would that have to do with gun violence prevention? That um, bill will lay the foundation for community violence prevention groups to potentially draw down on Medicaid as a reimbursement for Medicaid as a funding source. So if they have community health workers who are actually classified and trained as that, they could then be reimbursed by the government for their services. And so really starting to think about, again, what are those policies that can not only help with funding, but also address some of those root causes that can drive violence. Um, and put it as a policy priority. So definitely something on our radar and something that we've been discussing with Tracy and others about moving forward. And so thank you for raising those two particular policies. So I'll flag those for Tracy.
And today, I think, was the day for housing, was it not, at Legislative Hall?
Right?
So
It was.
hopefully
And
there were
Tracy was there today.
lots and lots of people. Our colleague Lynn Keelhorn was certainly there to support Sonia Starr and Housing Alliance Delaware, with whom we've been significantly involved. And you make the point, whether it's whatever it is, whether it's gun violence, whether it's student performance, whether it's job readiness. I mean, having a home, a place to live is without that, how do you make any forward progress? Do you know? It would seem to me that that issue needs some preeminence in terms of the work that needs to be done because of the consequences. I mean, sure, you need Head Start programs and you need this and you need that, but it, I keep thinking about children who are, living in shelters or in cars or whatever. How are they ever supposed to get any form of meaningful education, no matter what resources you put into the education system, if they don't have a place to live? It's striking.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that from working in government and even in this role, people often say, like, what's the number one issue? And people are like, oh, it's education. But then people go back between this education and housing. But then people say, like, how do you get to school if you don't have a house? And it's like the chicken before the egg. But yes, housing is definitely a critical piece to gun violence prevention. And I think that one of the things I like about the vital conditions framework is it's not just housing, but humane housing.
Mm.
And I think that that is really important.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy to answer any more questions that you all may have. I know that this is a topic that you all have been involved with for some time. And so that's great to hear. And I think that there will be a lot of exciting developments in the ecosystem with this state office and really providing the support and capacity to your communities because, as you said, Roger, you know, people have focused on Newcastle, and there is some success story, so to speak, on what happens when you do address it. But like, does it have to get that bad for the intervention? And I don't think we're at a place where it does have to get that bad. And I think there's been enough conversation to contextualize what is expected to happen when if we look at the data. That if we don't address this, it will become a issue that becomes out of hand. And so where you're trying to continue to decrease in Newcastle and scale up and sustain that, how do you make sure that Kent and Sussex are definitely a part of the conversation and something that has been top of mind for me? I'll be in Sussex next week just because of that, and making sure that it's not only conversations, but it's the FaceTime and putting the investment in. Um, and we were just on a call today with some people working at the state, and they're just like, we see what's happening in the other counties.
Yeah. It's economically you see Middletown's growing like leaps and bounds, and they're putting like what is another 1 million square foot warehouse in next to the other 1 million square foot
Right.
warehouse.
Right.
And but that's close to I-95 corridor, so the trucks can get there. But Dover's just a little bit further south, and I don't see that sort of hope where, I mean, it's unfortunate that that's the type of jobs we're creating in this state, which is warehouse jobs, but at least they're jobs.
Jobs.
But Dover's just a little bit off the highway, down there. So it's going to be a tough row for the new governor to figure out what to do economically in Dover.
Yeah, and I think like you bring up a very valid point when we were just having a conversation I think it was last week about violence prevention. The conversation actually just ended up talking about economic development. And this was for something in Sussex, but that was what we ended up talking about the most. And so I think that that is why we definitely want one of my goals for this year, as I deepen relationships, is really to start engaging with the county leadership and really building relationships with some of the municipal leaders, such as your Wilmington, your Dovers, your Seaford, your Milford, the Laurels, and also the business community when you think about the role that they play in this conversation. So I think you're spot on to think about needing hope, number one, but then also housing, economic development, and education are critical pieces. And I know that things that are a priority for this governor, but it doesn't change that it becomes even more pressing as we watch things happen federally that I think people wonder, say, well, how does that impact us in the state? How does that impact us at the county and municipal level? And so I think this is definitely a time where we're all just trying to figure out how to meet the needs when the funding that is was once available. You always needed more, but the funding
Mm.
that was once available, maybe for some of these critical programs, are depleting without warning.
Yeah.
Well, that's my biggest worry is you sit here and you think, wait, it could get a lot worse. And the most vulnerable people, I mean, it could bump people out of their houses and be out of the ability to live a decent life. And it's very scary. It's very scary.
Yeah.
I wouldn't I don't disagree, and it's something that I think about often when I see some of the updates come, and I was just like, this, what does this mean? I said I think we got some insight for COVID. I said, but there was at least money flowing federally and where philanthropy could supplement and where there was an opportunity to kind of have that conversation. But where it looks like, it's dependent upon the state and philanthropy, it's just like, well, philanthropy is not there to take the place of government. And so I think it is something that we're bracing for. And I think that I'm pretty sure it gives people a lot of anxiety at all levels of government that see the realities of this, but no more than the people who will be directly impacted. And when some of the first set of cuts came down earlier this year, it was like, even if people were asking me if our organization was impacted, I was like, no, our funding wasn't impacted, but we'll definitely be impacted because the issue that we care about relies on a lot of the programming and social service dollars. And so when you're pulling both of those away, like, it's going to be a pretty rough road when you look at the realities. And I think that people are trying to brace and prepare as much as possible, but at the same time, can is there resources to meet the demand? And so I think that it is a very time, and it's all we can do is be vigilant and keep having the conversations such as this. But I think it's also, we're going to wait and see what the state budget is, and wait and see what the municipal budgets are in some of these conversations, and just figure out how can we do the best we can with what we're left with, which is scary. Because then you think about, again, as you said, the most vulnerable among us. Where does this leave them?
Yeah. We with Westminster, with the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew, sponsor a First Friday walk for justice and peace in Wilmington. We've been doing it since George Floyd's death, actually murder. Um, and the focus is broadly on issues of justice and peace and Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And we're called by God to work for justice and peace. But once a year, and it's in June, Ann McWalter and Moms Demand Action join us for that walk. And so at our next walk, we expect to have a sizable contingent of people focused on ending gun violence as an essential component to creating peace in our homes, in our families, in our communities. And we're grateful for the opportunity to be able to highlight that issue. We walk silently up Market Street. We get a lot of comments from people who are in cars. Well, that's usually horns beeping, or people that we pass on the street thanking us for our public witness. And so we are grateful for the opportunity in the midst of all of this horror to be able to persevere and make the case that this commitment is essential and we're not giving up. So.
Absolutely. And I think that that is awesome. I think I did see it on the We're Orange website listed as one of the opportunities that is taking place. And I thank you for your continued work. And I think that you are absolutely correct. In spite of all of this, we still show up and we still have the conversations, and we still keep pressing forward, recognizing that if we don't, it makes it faster for the other things to happen. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with all of you and learn about the work that you've been doing. And I think that it's very, we're 5 years post George Floyd just this week. And so I think it's an interesting backdrop, or we think about a lot of the things that we're having conversations with, like, we're going further back even from where we thought we were 5 years ago, or that's the attempt. And so I think that it's just important in the spirit of, I think, a lot of the conversations and self-reflection that we've probably done individually, and that collective, like, commitment to topics of justice and truth and community well-being, that we persevere in spite of it, even though it could kind of just be easy not to per se give up, but just not to say anything, which I think a lot of people want to do in this moment. So I really am grateful for the opportunity to meet with you all, and also to learn about the work you're doing. And thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being here, Lauren. We really appreciate it, and we are fully behind the work you're doing. We love the energy and the commitment and the broad strategic perspective that you bring to this. There are a lot of people, boots on the ground doing the work, but making sure that it's done in as collaborative and effective a way as possible really means that the resources we do have, even if they're reduced, are going to be employed in as meaningful and effective a way as possible. So we thank you for your work.
Awesome. Well, thank you, all. I really am grateful for the opportunity to share. And yes, I think that we each day, a board member and I talk about, like in this moment, ECVN, we talked about, it was talked about, but even when talked about, I don't think people envisioned a time such as this. And so I think that it has shown to be a helpful resource as we try to make sense of a lot of the things that are happening very fast and the domino trickle down effects that it has in our states and in our communities. And so grateful that we can stand in partnership with you all. And if there's any ways that I or ECVN can be helpful, and if there's other policies that come up where like, oh, well, I think that this intersects or overlaps, definitely feel free to email me, email Tracy, who I know you're also in contact with, to make sure that we are being mindful and being as inclusive as possible. But I really do appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. I'd like to share some good news with the
Yeah.
group. HB House Bill 133 was voted out of the Judiciary Committee today, which is an important step, one that Lynn hoped would happen but wasn't sure that would. This is a bill that gives judges the ability to remove part or all of certain court-ordered financial penalties, fees, if it decides the defendant qualifies for a hardship waiver. So we're delighted that that's made its way out of the Judiciary Committee, I think headed to the House floor. So kudos to Lynn, who has her fingers in more pies than I can count. But we're grateful for her energy and commitment and for the wisdom of the Judiciary Committee in passing that bill along. So we'll keep
Mhm.
our eye on, what is it, the eye on the prize, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. Um,
Yep.
Next
Thank
week, we will have Dave McBride. Some of you know him. He's Sarah's father. Oh, yes, he's also an attorney and a member of Westminster Church. And he is going to offer a program on due process,
Hmm.
which I think it could not be more timely.
Yeah.
And will share with us the origins of the concept of due process, its importance as an underpinning of democracy, some case law that has been impacting it in recent times, and the current immigration system and its intersection with due process. So mark your calendars, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank
Very
you
good.
all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren.
Well,
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.